Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be finishing up exploring Italy and Egypt and moving on to Yemen. Yes, I hacked off most of my hair. I was feeling the need for a change, and I have not had my hair this short since I was about 13. And I think a lot of people seeing it would say, oh, it's not that short, but it is for me. So today I'm continuing on in the adventure of Around the World in 80 Days Readathon. And so last week I was supposed to wrap up Italy. I did not. And now we're already done with Egypt. This is the last day, technically last day, of the Egyptian week. So let's look at quick where we are on the chart. So we started with England, and then we went to France, and then Italy and Egypt, and next we will be going to Yemen. For that, I actually just started today, The Fox Hunt by Muhammad al-Samawi. So this book is more of like a nonfiction escape story of how Muhammad traveled from Yemen to the United States, I believe. However, I did want to find a second one for this week, and I just couldn't find it. However, and this may be like a little bit of a far-fetched option, but I am planning to read it, and we'll see if it actually counts. So Yemen in like very ancient times was part of this Sabaean kingdom. This is about 12th century BC, and it is actually claimed to be the origin of the Queen of Sheba, who's mentioned in the Bible having to do with Solomon. And so I know this is like a long shot because technically the Queen of Sheba could not be from Yemen. She could be from a completely other place. But I did find this book that was like a Christian novel retelling of the Queen of Sheba story, and it's called The Legend of Sheba, The Rise of a Queen by Tosca Lee. And so I got this from the library already, and it looks like a light, like drama, romance, Christian story, and it looks really good. So I am going to add that to my TBR this coming week. Let's go back and wrap up the books that I finished from Italy and Egypt. The Italian book, I ended up only reading one book. However, coming out of the Count of Monte Cristo set in France, I definitely found myself that I couldn't tackle two books from Italy in that week because I was just coming down from reading a 1,200-page book. It was a lot. So I read The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni. This book was not quite what I was expecting. So for those who grew up with Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, you may remember that the girls, Jo, Meg, Amy, and Beth, performed this play about this dastardly Don Rodrigo who captures this innocent girl and her love must come and save her. It's a great depiction in the book Little Women, but I had no idea that was based off of this book. So very, very cool reference that is from my childhood that I did not get. But so this book I thought of as being that type of gothic romance type style that I saw from Little Women. And while yes, there is some of that in this book, that is not at all what this book is. So this book does follow Renzo and Lucia. They are these young lovers in Lombardy, which is a part of Italy. It was actually under Spanish control in the 17th century, which is when this takes place. And they are in love, and this dastardly Spanish guy who's in charge, Don Rodrigo, falls in love with Lucia and decides to prevent the marriage. At first, he just like threatens the priest that's going to marry them, and so the priest won't marry them. And then eventually he decides to kidnap Lucia, but that all goes awry. So Renzo and Lucia end up having to escape from, I don't think they're from Milan. They're from like this small little village. And there is a lot of drama that ensues. So Lucia and Renzo are separated for some time. There's also a lot of like political and social commentary that was going on during that time. I want to preface this by saying this book is extremely Catholic. I did not realize that going in. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, I'm Catholic. But for a lot of modern readers who are more secular, I feel like you're going to struggle with a lot of the themes in this book because a lot of them are very Catholic. So there is at one point this priest who says to Renzo, and Renzo wants to, kill Don Rodrigo, duel with him and destroy him for, destroying him and Lucia's life. And the priest says, no, God would not want that. You must forgive him and rise above this anger, because if you let anger and revenge consume you, you will never be happy. Which is also kind of, oddly enough, the message of The Count of Monte Cristo, which I read right before this book. So that's very ironic. But so this book has very Catholic messaging. And so a lot of the things it explores are from the lens of Catholicism, which makes sense because Manzoni was writing in the early 1800s in Italy. And so Italy, I mean, it still is predominantly Catholic, but it is less so nowadays than it was back in the 1800s, and even more so in the 1600s. And this book does not go where you expect it to go. And this gets into slight spoilers, so I will give a brief spoiler warning. I won't get into all the details of the spoilers, but I just want to put that out there. So I expected in the end that Renzo and Lucia would have to face Don Rodrigo. In the 1628, 1630, around that era, there was a horrible plague that was actually, I believe, the second wave of the Black Death that swept throughout Europe. And I believe it killed about 25% of the population of Italy. It's estimated. It's hard to say exactly how many. And so the second half of this book deals with that plague. And so it deals with a lot of death. A lot of characters die. A lot of good people are hurt and die. And Don Rodrigo is one of those people who dies of the plague. So here's this evil guy who kept Lucia and Renzo apart throughout the entire half of the book. And you see him as a villain. And the last time that Renzo sees him, he just sees him on this bed dying from the plague. So yeah, Don Rodrigo dies in the end. And it is a pretty happy ending, relatively. I was expecting it to be a lot worse, considering plague is the second half of the book. And the middle chunk of the book is all about descriptions of the political and social and plagues that are going through Italy during that time. So it's less about the story. What I'm trying to say about my review of this book is that I was expecting it to be a Gothic romance. It is that to a certain extent, but it is much more a commentary on the Catholic history during that time and understanding these characters, and very different characters. My favorite character is unnamed, oddly enough. He is this lord who Don Rodrigo convinces to capture Lucia, and he realizes how holy and gentle she is, and he gets converted. He's like this criminal mobster almost, and he just gets converted and lives that great life. I just loved his character because I think he is by far the most nuanced character, because you see him in the beginning being kind of bloodthirsty and mean, and then you see him slowly transform and then become a good person. So fascinating characters. The characters are the highlight of the book, as is the social commentary, but it's not so much like a dramatic Gothic romance that I was expecting it to be. All right, so now we traveled to Egypt, which was this past week, which just finished today, and I ended up reading 2 books for that. In fact, I was pretty sure I was only going to read 1, but then the second book I skimmed through a lot because I found it very boring. So I'll get to the good one first, and then the not so good one next. So the first book I read was Egypt's Golden Couple, When Akhenaten and Nefertiti Were Gods on Earth, by John Darnell and Colleen Darnell. And I love these two. They're on YouTube, and Colleen Darnell does Instagram lives about, about Egypt and about archaeology, and she also dresses in 1920s fashion most of the time. They're a really cool couple. And so when I saw they were coming out with this book, I asked it for Christmas, and my mother-in-law got it for me, which was wonderful, and I loved this book. So basically the format, how it's set out is the first section of each chapter is almost a more fictionalized reimagining of a scene within ancient Egypt. So it may be a parade that Akhenaten and Nefertiti are part of, and you're just seeing that scene as it would have been during the time. And so while it is based on true archaeological evidence, as well as the writing of ancient Egypt, it is kind of an imagining of how it would be, how it might have been. And then the rest of the chapter is much more nonfiction. It also has, I appreciated all the art looked at in the book, whether they are actual like photography of ancient Egyptian stuff that are discussed in that chapter, or if it's like the art that is actually being talked about at the time. And I found this book fascinating. It doesn't necessarily go in chronological order. It starts off in chronological order because we learn a lot about Akhenaten's parents, and then you learn about him and Nefertiti. So in that sense, it's a little chronological in the beginning, but and at the end as well. But in the middle, it kind of deviates and explores different topics as opposed to like in chronological order. But it's a very fascinating book. If you didn't know, Akhenaten was a very rare ancient Egyptian pharaoh, because he decided instead of worshiping all these different various gods, he wanted to worship just one god, the sun god. And so he is often credited as being polytheist? No. Polytheist means many gods. One god type thing. A theist, and he is a rare pharaoh because of that. And he ruled, I believe, for like 13 years. He was like in his early teens when he became pharaoh, and he died at around 30. And he's also famous for being Tutankhamun's his father. And so at the end of the book, it's really funny, and we'll get to the funny relation it has to the second book I read in a minute. It's funny because it discusses Tutankhamun as well as the finding of Tutankhamun's tomb. So this is a really interesting book. It's clear that the Darnells have a lot of knowledge on ancient Egyptian history, but I also appreciated that it takes into account that like your average reader is not going to be super scholarly when they're reading this book. And so, anyone can pick this up off the shelf and enjoy it without having a lot of previous knowledge about ancient Egypt. So I really enjoyed it because not only does it examine Akhenaten and Nefertiti, but it also examines just general understanding about Egypt. Not only Egypt in like ancient Egypt, but also Egypt as in like the Egypt that the Darnells are examining now. So a more modern, dilapidated ancient Egypt, so like the remnants of ancient Egypt. So I love the descriptions of both what ancient Egypt would have looked like and what it looks like now, the remnants of this great civilization. So really great book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, I think. In fact, I think I gave this one also a 5 out of 5 stars. And then the second book, unfortunately, that I read for this week did not go as well. It's the Tutankhamun, the Untold Story by Thomas Hoving. Now, this was partially my fault because I didn't look up anything about this book before reading it, but I assumed it would be about Tutankhamun, which I thought would be perfect to read after the Darnell book because I'm like, I learn about Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's father, and then I'm going to learn about Tutankhamun. The problem is this book is not about Tutankhamun. It is specifically about the finding of Tutankhamun's tomb. And so it follows Howard Carter is the most famous name associated with the finding of the tomb. George Herbert, who was the earl that basically funded the expedition. And you have a lot of the political and social surroundings of exactly how they were able to find the tomb, the history, a little bit of what digging was like, in the 20 years previous to the finding of Tutankhamun's tomb. I think we spend about 3 paragraphs of this entire, almost 400-page book on Tutankhamun. We learn nothing about it. And part of that reason is because this book is from the 1970s. So they were still learning a lot about ancient Egypt. I mean, we're still learning a whole lot about it. But now, 50 years later, we know a lot more about it. There's a lot more knowledge when it comes to understanding hieroglyphics, as well as understanding the social and political stuff, piecing together ancient Egypt more. So I understand that there wasn't as much information out there for Hoving to put together, but this book was just so boring. So boring. And I did not care about Carter. Yeah, it was interesting to learn a little bit more about the founding of Tutankhamun's tomb, but I was more curious to learn about like ancient Egypt, and there was nothing in this about ancient Egypt. It was more about the modern, or the relatively modern, the 1920s situation in Egypt when it came to archaeology during that time. So I ended up giving this, I think, 3 out of 5 stars, just because I realized that there's certain people who are more interested in the finding of the tomb who would like this book. But this was not for me. But with that, we finish Egypt, and I'm going to Yemen, and I will hopefully be able to update you next week. How is your reading going for this readathon? If you are reading, and if you haven't joined but you have more time now to join along, you can join at any time. Don't feel the pressure that like you need to be joining every single week. If you're curious about a certain country or a book from a certain country, you can always join for like 1 week and then just go about your business. So I want to know, have you read any of these books? How are your weeks? How is your reading going for this readathon? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.